Legislative leaders and the governor met again for the first time after a brutal campaign cycle. We'll talk about it next on Capitol View. Welcome to Capitol View. I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and joining us today is Emilee Fannon with WCIA. Emilee, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
And Andrew Maloney with the Chicago Daily Law Bulletin. Andy, welcome back.
Good to be back.
So we had the first week of veto session this past week. It was cut a little short, but lawmakers did come into town. They were in session, and there were some meetings between the legislative leaders and the governor. Andy, that started off to kind of a rocky start over the weekend and the early part of the week. Can you tell us a little bit about what was going on?
Yeah, I think you still arguably saw some scars from the campaign season that you mentioned there. You had basically some posturing, a lot of jabs back and forth. Especially because initially the House Speaker, Mike Madigan, a Democrat, said scheduling conflict early in the week. And I think that probably rubbed the Republican leaders the wrong way. And they came out and said, well, he should be here. He eventually went on Tuesday, I think, and came in and said when he came out that he was going to appoint one of his lieutenants, Representative Greg Harris, to do these negotiations. And the Republicans came out and said, we didn't agree to that, number one. And number two, we've already got these working groups going on. So we're already sort of outsourcing some of this process. We don't see how this is going to help things. We don't see how this is going to get us past this stopgap budget. So it was contentious, and I don't think there's a whole lot of reason to believe that it will stop being a contentious process, although they did continue to meet, and we'll see if there's any progress when they come back to the Capitol after Thanksgiving.
Well, and Emilee, the reason why this is being so closely watched is because that stopgap funding does expire here at the end of the year, and everyone's waiting to see, are we going to get a budget? What's going to happen? Are we any closer after this week?
It was interesting to watch, but the leaders' meetings, as they come out, it's kind of the same song and dance. It was the same tone. I would say the first leaders' meeting, when everyone was there, it was still a little bit of finger pointing. The next day was kind of a shocking surprise of, they actually talked about reforms. So maybe the ball is rolling. They're talking about some reforms that Rauner wanted, but it will be interesting to see that now all of a sudden Democrats say, we've never seen these before. So we're gonna take a step back, we'll review them, and they'll come back to the negotiating table. Whereas Republicans say, hey, this is the same report we gave you last December. So, everyone's kind of on the edge a little bit, but it was a little bit different atmosphere, I think, with Representative Greg Harris there. To me, it seemed like maybe Madigan was throwing in the towel a little bit, where, okay, I'm going to bring him to the table. Maybe he'll get along better with you guys. So yeah, it was interesting.
Andy, the focus is clearly the governor and the speaker and their inability to come together. So does bringing in someone like Representative Harris hurt the equation?
Yeah, and it's hard to know exactly because we're not privy directly to these meetings. We had the one instance last year where they did a live shot of the leaders meeting, and it was pretty awkward for everybody, I think. But
including those
involved and those watching. So we don't know exactly how this is going. As Emilee mentioned, they did come out and say that we talked about some of the governor's reforms a little bit. We did hear about, for instance, there were bills on workers' compensation and redistricting that were looked at, but so far details, I think, have been scant on that. I still think the big takeaway is just that this is going to be a hard process, as it always is, but even harder than usual. And in the meantime, the peripherals this week got worse. You had reports coming out from the governor's budget office saying Illinois' economic picture not getting a whole lot better. You had unfunded pension liability. It's higher than it has been, and it's already above $100 billion. So while there was some more political sort of back and forth and kind of that residue from the campaign season, you had a situation that is still getting worse.
Yeah, one of the things that seemed to reverberate in that meeting was the report of the backlog of bills is going to be perhaps even higher than folks realized, maybe $13 billion by the end of the year. What did the leaders have to say about that? I know President Cullerton kind of commented on that a little bit.
I mean, they were both shocked, and they're worried about the people of Illinois because it's their job to get this done, before December 31st. But I mean, they both kind of said the same thing, these numbers are alarming. Let's do something about it. But then, you have Speaker Madigan saying, well, I've successfully passed 7 budgets. Let's stick to the framework. Madigan likes saying these little slogans over and over again. So I'm sure when they meet again, he'll still keep pushing, hey, I think I know what I'm doing in a way. But Republicans then again are, hey, this hasn't been working. So.
And clearly, any Republican gains, there weren't big gains in either chamber, 2 in the Senate, 4 in the House. Clearly, the Speaker doesn't believe there's any sort of mandate from the voters that he change his mind on the way that this is being that this is taking place, and neither does Governor Rauner. So they're still at loggerheads, and as we've said, it's going to be a tough process.
This pulling another lawmaker in to this process that the Speaker is doing, Representative Harris, I mean, he is known for being fairly pragmatic. He negotiated the same-sex marriage legislation, didn't bring it for a vote at one point because he didn't think he had the numbers and was maybe criticized for that, but eventually pushed it over the finish line and was viewed as this very practical deal maker.
With some Republican votes on it.
Yeah, so does he bring something to this that maybe isn't there right now, or...
He does. Well, he is one of the lawmakers who has done extensive work on the budget, in particular on things like human services and things that have made headlines and sort of pushed people to, okay, this is a real serious situation. We need to get to work. So I do think having that personality involved could help. He's if you envision sort of the model kind of negotiator for this type of thing, he might be it. But as I've said, we don't have sort of the big indicators from any of the leaders that we've made a lot of substantial progress since that happened, I think.
And it'll also be interesting how Madigan said that he might want to add more team members. As of this week, they ended not saying if they're going to add any more, but that is something curious that he mentioned. So he might be even bringing more people to the table, which I'm sure Republicans are not going to be too fond of.
Yeah, Indy, I can see the perception of that being seen as slowing down the situation because we've seen these small groups already try over and over again.
Right.
But if we go back to a time before Governor Rauner and before this current impasse, we did see small groups, work together successfully on workers' compensation or pension reform. I mean, this is a strategy that has played out positively in the past.
Right. When you can get the rank and file members engaged and working in a way that makes them feel valued, I guess is the right word for it, by leadership. When you can get sort of them bringing up their constituents' concerns and them bringing personal anecdotes about how something as massive as this budget problem is affecting the people they represent, I think it does add a little bit more urgency. I don't think there are any illusions that this is not a big deal already, but perhaps that experience is shaping the Speaker and some others and their opinions that, okay, let's keep trying to bring more people into this process. And maybe that'll push us over the edge.
But it's also gotten so bitter that it makes sense that the Republicans are looking at it like, is this a tactic to just throw a wrench in this situation?
Right, exactly. And this election, as we talked about a lot on the national level, and I think it played out that way at the state level too, this was an especially bitter election. It didn't do much to soothe anybody's wounds over a bitter legislative session and a bitter budget fight that has been going on for more than a year and basically since the governor took office. So while this might be a good tactic historically, perhaps we are in some unprecedented territory.
Well, and lawmakers are back in town for what is called the veto session. So it's the time for the General Assembly to be able to take up any vetoes that the governor may have made of legislation. Oftentimes they don't end up taking up a lot of the vetoes, but Emilee, they did, the Senate at least, picked up that automatic voter registration veto that the governor had made. Can you tell us a little bit about what that legislation is and what's going on there?
Right. Automatic voter registration, when you get a license or something like that, you would automatically asked if you want to become a voter. Democrats seem to love it, most of them. A lot of Republicans argue, however, it can create a lot of fraud in the system. However, it did pass in the Senate. Now it will move to the House, and that's where it is definitely going to get interesting. I think it's going to be much harder to pass, and how there's more people in the House. So it would be interesting to see where that goes.
And that was one of the more interesting veto messages, I think, if there's a spectrum of interest on how these play out. But the governor, if I remember correctly, struck sort of a positive tone when he vetoed that. He said, I'm in favor of bringing more people into the democratic process and getting them registered to vote. But this doesn't comply with our reading of the National Voter Registration Act, which says that, among other things, when you register, you have to attest that you meet eligibility criteria. And so that was one of the big things that he relied on, I think, when he vetoed the legislation. Now, Senator Manar, Democrat, who sponsors it in that chamber, has said that that's not an issue. People still have to, I think, basically say that they are eligible voters. They can opt out of it. There's plenty of scrutiny from the state elections board and local election authorities. But there was kind of this view from some, I think, that they could, this was a principle that made sense to some people in both parties. But like you said, it was still kind of contentious. The Senate overrode the veto, I think 38-18, probably most of those votes Republican against. So I do think it'll also have some trouble in the House, as Emilee said. There's just a lot more rancor, I think, and as we learned in the elections, they lost some members of the Democratic supermajority, so it's going to be harder for them to override the governor's will.
Yeah, in the Senate, of course, those folks won't have swapped out yet, but there's still frustration, and they still have the veto-proof majority in the House. But there's 3 or 4 people who often don't go along with that in the Democratic caucus. Yeah. And the Senate has a much larger block of Democrats and probably a bigger block of liberal Democrats.
Right.
So this, I think, is kind of maybe foreshadowing the tale of any veto overrides that we see happen perhaps in the final week, that the Senate is going to have the votes if they want to try to override the governor on a lot of things, but the House has really struggled with this, right, in the past.
Yeah, so I think that of the handful of override votes that they took, I think the Senate approved all of them, and the few that the House took were not overridden. So you had that play out already.
All right, well, there are a few other things going on as lawmakers are back in town. One of the big issues that a lot of people have their eye on is a legislation proposed to help they're calling it a bailout if you're for it, or if you're against it, if you're for it. I'm not sure what the phrasing is, but basically to help the state's nuclear power plants stay afloat, be profitable. Andy, what's going on here? Let's just get kind of the broad strokes, because this bill keeps changing and being reworked. It's really pretty contentious when you're talking about raising what they pay for their utilities.
Right, yeah. The power providers like Ameren and ComEd have already said this is going to increase rates, by an average of like 75 cents for one, 22 for another. But yeah, this we're looking at subsidies for nuclear and certain types of coal-fired power plants. There's a lot going on in this. The proponents say that it'll help the state save something like $4 billion in the long run. But I think anytime you mess with very large utilities bills, power bills, that types of thing, it's a complex system. It's hard for people to digest, and we saw a committee hearing take 7 hours this week for people to sort of go over it. So there's a lot happening there. It likely will resurface again, maybe not for floor votes, but it'll come up again as we go forward during the veto session.
And it will be interesting because time is almost running out for this bill as well, to save it or not to save it. There's thousands of jobs at stake too, so you got people who are saying this is great for the economy, this is great, good paying jobs that can be lost. But then again, you got low-income people who are people on our assistance, all their bills are going to go up. So it's vice versa. There's benefits, there's not benefits, but it is going to be interesting how they vote on it and how early they will vote on it. Because committee, we thought it was going to get out of committee. I thought it was going to be called at least this week. Proved to be wrong because they were discussing it for 7 hours. So there's a lot of controversy on it.
Yeah, I've been to some marathon committee hearings, but 7 hours, really, that's a long one.
that is long even by those standards.
Yeah. So other news that took place outside of the veto session in the General Assembly this week was that the state's labor board ruled on the ongoing fight between AFSCME and the governor's administration over their contract. And they did rule, Andy, that there is an impasse, which is what the governor was hoping for. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with this? Again, another pretty complex issue that affects a lot of folks.
A labor issue, kind of tough to digest, but essentially, this is part of what the governor was elected on. This is one of his platform issues was, I think, if not always explicitly, but I think a lot of people understood was weakening the influence of labor in Illinois. So essentially when the negotiations or the contract between AFSCME, the state's largest public worker union, and the state ceased in 2015, they had to renegotiate a new contract. They couldn't agree on the terms, right? And so there's this process that plays out, and when it becomes apparent to some members in that process that they can't reach an agreement, you have an administrative law judge who rules, okay, can these sides still come to an agreement or can't they? We had one of those judges say, well, there's a mix. They can agree on some issues, they can't agree on others. They should go back to the bargaining table and try and resolve some of those. But this week we had the Illinois Labor Relations Board in a 5-0 decision in Chicago say, no, they're at impasse, which basically means that the governor can begin to implement his terms on a contract with AFSCME employees, and I think it gets us one step closer to perhaps a labor strike with that union, which would be unprecedented territory.
Yeah, and the kind of basis of the arguments of this are the governor saying they want too much. The AFSCME's asking for things that are a little too pricey given the state's budget situation, and AFSCME's saying the governor's office will not budge at all, that they basically sat down with these sort of what AFSCME considers wild requests and would not back off of those. But Emilee, what does AFSCME do now? Do they have any kind of recourse?
They want to obviously come back to the negotiating table, but there's rumors of maybe they'll go on strike, but they've always kind of had that in the back of their mind. Obviously, we have not seen any action on that, but it's just something to watch. It's been a very long, ongoing battle, so another thing to definitely keep paying attention to and what happens.
And another maneuver, in addition to going on strike, is they've already pledged that they're going to appeal this decision to state court, right? So. They can't do it, I guess, technically until the decision is in writing, and then they can appeal it, but you should see some adjudication at another level in the coming weeks and months on that. As you said, the AFSCME thinks that the governor's demands are unreasonable in a lot of areas. The flavor of one of those areas, I think, is that he wants 40-hour work weeks before overtime kicks in instead of 37 and a half. He says that this is what most employees outside the public sector work with, so state employees should have to work with it too. And of course, AFSCME, trying to represent their employees, they've had it this way for a while now and would like to keep it that way. So there's just a lot going on there.
And the one that seems to have people maybe the most fired up would be basically doubling the cost of health care for public employees, which a lot of folks out there are pretty upset about that prospect potentially.
Correct.
So Andy, we mentioned that AFSCME hasn't striked. We haven't seen anything like this in the past. Are they prepared for a strike? I mean, they don't have a strike fund. It's going to be tough for them to make this decision.
Right. It'll be tough, and there are always costs with with doing something so drastic, right? And sometimes things that you might not even anticipate going in, right? Because you don't want to, for instance, arguably galvanize people who agree with the governor in saying that public labor is too strong and we need to weaken their influence. We've seen Ask Me employees, I think today, in response to the decision, some of them are already outside calling attention to this issue. So it's not, they're not on strike yet, but it's almost sort of like a practice round in a way. So it's always a big decision. I think they are going to wait and see exactly how this plays out. And like you said, they still have some administrative things that they have to take care of if they want to pursue that. But as you said, it's something that hasn't happened before. So it'll be fascinating to watch.
Well, national politics are again kind of playing out a little here at the state level, or at least having some influence. A couple different things. Folks had been looking to see if Senator Dick Durbin might have some kind of interest in running for governor. He's kind of really closed the door on that, right, Andy?
Yeah, he basically said this week, I was, I got my job again being the whip in the U.S. Senate for the Democrats. That's an important gig.
Coolest job title.
It's a very cool job title. And so he's basically, I think he was asked specifically, okay, so you're shutting the door on this. And he said, yeah, I'm shutting the door on it.
I think he let a few people know too,
right,
well ahead of time.
Right. And so there was a shift, I think, for Democrats in terms of who they want to potentially get to challenge Governor Rauner in 2018. There were some candidates that you've seen floated before. Chris Kennedy's name came up again. Maybe some names that you're not as familiar with. J.B. Pritzker, I think, is one of them. He's a billionaire business person, also heavily interested in education, just like Governor Rauner has sort of the money that Governor Rauner does, but has a history of supporting Democrats. So those were a couple names that surfaced again and surfaced for the first time after Senator Durbin shut the door on a potential run.
And the governor told reporters that he has spoken with the president-elect Donald Trump. He did not use his name again. He has really avoided that. Emilee, what did he say about their conversation? And tell us a little bit about why he's really choosing not to say the word Trump.
Well, even on the show, I think we've mentioned it multiple times. He will never make comments about it. But in the past, as you saw, maybe some of the ugly campaign ads, I will vote Republican ticket. So it's been this fight, especially with reporters, as myself, trying to get it out of him. But yes, this week he did make a statement that he had a phone conversation with President-elect, never used the word, Donald Trump. He has some familiar friends with him as well. He has some allies. It was a positive conversation. They look forward to talking again. It was very brief, but seems like they have good relations, and they'll be in contact soon again.
Yeah, Andy, the Democrats spent a lot in PACs associated with Democrats spent a lot of money tying Republicans to Trump in a negative fashion in this campaign. Seems like the president-elect maybe kind of understands why the governor has not embraced him as much during the election season.
Very true, yeah. And in a state like Illinois, which was described at least by one outlet this week as sort of the blue island amongst all of the sea of red in terms of what states voted for which party. I think they understand that there was a balance that the governor had to maintain, and while Donald Trump did win the election, he still didn't win the popular vote. He certainly didn't win in Illinois, and his unfavorable rating was pretty low too, even throughout the entire course of the campaign. So on top of that, Mike Pence, governor of Indiana, going to be the vice president. You have to assume that he and Governor Rauner, they know each other. They're both Republican governors. Governor Rauner frequently cited Mitch Daniels, the previous Republican governor of Indiana, being one of his heroes and one of his models for conducting business. So, it can be a small world in national politics sometimes, and as Emilee pointed out, they've had similar, I think, advisors, at least sort of on the tertiary, so they know some of the same people. I think it's, on the national level, they're willing to let bygones be bygones on this, and who knows, maybe we'll see Governor Rauner embrace President-elect Trump once he becomes the president.
And the governor never went as far as some other Republicans in the state to denounce him or to withdraw support. He just kept it low-key.
Correct, right, yeah. Just didn't bring up the name and just sort of stuck to the line of...
I will not comment on the presidential race.
Right, exactly.
I will not make any comments.
Right.
And everyone always had to say, well, you said you would vote the ticket, but Bernie always had to throw that in, but no answer.
Well, Andy, a report came out on asset forfeiture, which a lot of folks out there may not know what that is, but it's a pretty interesting topic once you dig into it. We've just got a few minutes left, but can you tell me a little bit about this report?
Yeah.
Let's start with, what is asset forfeiture?
So it's basically when police come in and they could take property when they believe it is involved in a crime or a criminal enterprise.
So if you have a car, they think you were selling drugs, driving around in this car.
Selling drugs or
take it
something,
away.
they might be able to take it away. Police powers have been an issue, I think, for the last couple of years, not just for shootings or surveillance cameras or anything like that, but also how much authority they have to take people's property. There are legitimate reasons that they can take some of this stuff away from people who are drug dealing and committing other crimes, but a lot of people also believe that there's too much power. They can take too many things. You don't even have to be convicted of a crime to lose your property. So there was a report this week from the ACLU and the Illinois Policy Institute, which is sort of an
doesn't come
interesting...
together super often.
Right.
Yeah.
You have a more perhaps left-leaning group and then a right-leaning group coming together and saying, this is an issue in Illinois. Over the last 10 years, people have basically been forced to give up over $319 million in property to state law enforcement, not just the state police, but law enforcement around the state. And federal authorities, I believe the number was something like $400 million. So lots of money. This is something that lawmakers have discussed. They talked about it in the spring. They're looking into maybe putting more regulations on the ability to take property. But you can be sure it's going to be contentious.
So maybe getting on the radar, and we're going to have to leave it at that. I'd like to thank my guests, Emilee Fannon and Andy Maloney, and I'm your host, Jamey Dunn with Illinois Issues, and we'll see you next time on Capitol View.